in the background here, you'll see some dark trees. And so this is forest, and then you've got the tree line. Here it's fairly abrupt. You can see the change from the green to the sort of yellow of the tundra. And you'll notice that the trees are much, much darker than the surrounding tundra. So it's the sort of black car, white car analogy that if you have them both in the sun and you put your hand on each of them, the black car will feel much hotter because it's absorbing much more of the sun's incoming radiation, which means that it can convert that radiation to heat, which means more warming, which means presumably that you can move tree lines. So with warming, tree lines presumed to move northward and upslope, and you're replacing lighter colored vegetation with darker colored, which means more heat, more warming, and presumably more advance of tree line. And these sorts of things, tree line advance and permafrost thaw, for the most part, they occur very slowly, although you'll see there's some exceptions to this. And if you really want to, say, capture a tree line moving, you can't really go up and collect data for 1 year and expect to get a good handle on what's a decadal or centennial process. So one of the issues is that a lot of observations and experiments are very short term. They're only a year or two, and usually you can only get a year or two of funding, and then you have to wrap up the project. And so it's hard to get an idea of what the trends are. So a lot of you have seen temperature graphs, and you can see that there's these changes that happen over decades and centuries, that if you only have a year or two of data, you're going to be right in the middle of one of those trends. You know, if the temperature is doing this, if it's peaking, and you just take a sample on either end of that, you won't get an idea of what the trends are in that data set. And so long-term monitoring is very useful for, you've seen a lot of these climate models. They're making predictions for the future, and you want to validate those, see how accurate they are. So you need long-term data sets for that. Experimental results, you run an experiment for a year or two, say, looking at the effects of artificial warming on vegetation reproduction, and it'd be good to have a long data set that actually shows the changes in temperature and changes in vegetation reproduction over time, that you can be able to substantiate these experimental results. And the same for remote sensing, so using satellites to see what's on the ground and what the changes are. You really want to have field data to support those remotely obtained measurements. So this is where Earthwatch International comes in, and I'm guessing if you're here, you probably already know all this, but Earthwatch is great for supporting citizen scientists, which is where you guys come in. And this really allows us to increase our muscle for collecting data and conducting our scientific research. And they've funded a lot of projects. I hope my numbers are right here, that there's been 14 in 120 countries in the last 40 some years. And currently there's 60 in 40 countries, 2 of which are Leanne and myself. And there's a lot of the budget that goes towards research and engagement. I think that this is sort of the wave of the future, that in the past, science has sort of been happening in a vacuum. And if you're not in academia, or say, or in government, you don't get to really experience and see the science happening firsthand. You might not have a good idea of what the results are, especially given the current political climate. There's a lot of apparent uncertainty out there. So this is where I feel this sort of connection is really valuable, because we get to do the research, but we also get to distribute the results real time. And so these 2 projects, the one in Churchill and the one in the Mackenzie Mountains, have been supported for many years by Earthwatch, and they've been crucial in maintaining this long-term monitoring. Okay, so where are the places I'm going to talk about today? Well, here's Churchill, see it on Hudson Bay in eastern Canada, and then there's the Mackenzie Mountains, just near the Yukon border in the Northwest Territories. And these areas are notable, and actually it's very timely that this paper came out, because they're both permafrost landscapes, and they've both got a lot of thermokarst. And what thermokarst is a type of basically ice-rich permafrost that's thawing, so you have a lot of excess water. So it's sort of a collapsing permafrost landscape. And they have put this very, very interesting, useful map together of the coverage of this thermokarst landscape. And the darker colors here show that there's a very high coverage of those landscapes in each of those basically grid cells that make up this map. And there's Churchill. You can see that's got a very high incidence of wetland thermokarst. So this is, some of you guys might have seen this before. There's a lot of organic matter, there's a lot of ponds, and there's a lot of moisture that's locked up in the permafrost right now. And the same for the Mackenzie Mountains. Not as much in wetlands. There's moderate to high amounts of thermokarst landscape, but also in hill slopes, because we've got, in this pink color here, because we've got mountainous terrain up there. So these areas are right in these high, in these high thermokarst coverage landscapes. Okay, so now talking about the history of the research in the Mackenzie Mountains. So some context. It actually dates back to World War II. You have the bombing of Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941. And then you've got Japanese occupation of the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. And there was refineries being shelled, and basically the shipping lanes were compromised. So these areas where a lot of the fuel that was supporting troops were compromised. And so because of this, the US realized, wait a minute, so we've got troops that have occupied Alaska, and we don't really have any transportation network up there, and we don't have any way to get fuel up there now that the shipping's compromised. So we need to do something about that. So what they did was they built the canal pipeline in 1942. And it runs from, so here's the Yukon here, here's Norman Wells. They have the oil derricks there, the oil is extracted and it's transported along the line to refineries in Whitehorse. And they also built the Alaska Highway here so that they had a way to transport troops, people, materials up into Alaska, and also transport this new fuel source. So the study area is up here along the road that was built to service the pipeline. It's allowed us to access these very remote areas that aren't really practical otherwise. So these areas have permafrost, discontinuous permafrost, so there's just patches in the landscape. And most of these patches are these pulsas. So these are ice-filled, peat-covered permafrost mounds. And there's this fellow, Porsild, that was the first botanist to go into the area in 1944. And I'll talk more about him in a sec. But how these permafrost features form is in a given winter, you have, for whatever reason, the wind changes, you have an area that's cleared of snow, and it'll be, this is a wetland area, cleared of snow, so you have a lot of peat with a lot of moisture in it, and this gray area is the area that freezes. And you'll notice that because it's snow-free, that insulating layer of snow has allowed a lot more cold to penetrate in and form this depression into the ground where it freezes further down. So come summer, it's frozen deep enough that it doesn't actually thaw over the summer, and you get water from the surrounding wetland leaking in. It's drawn to this freezing front, and it creates these ice lenses. So the second winter, you've got the start of a mound with an ice lens, and then this process is repeated over and over, and you get this ice lensing uplift, and eventually you've got this permafrost mound that's able to persist because now it's a positive feature on the landscape, and it's snow-free over a lot of the winter. So it's able to cool each winter. And we actually see these ice lenses in our pulses up in the Mackenzie Mountains. So we've got the evidence that those ice lenses are there. So this is one of the first pictures of these pulses in the early 1940s. You can see there's Porsild there for scale. probably about 6 feet tall. And I'm just gonna flick back and forth because I've got repeat photos here, because the next time they were photographed was in the 1970s when Pete Kershaw went up as part of his grad research. And you'll see that these pulsas have actually shrunk over time. And carbon dating tells us that these pulsas are at least 1,100 years old. So they've persisted for millennia, but yet we see them disappearing over a period of decades or years. Here's another shot of that same area. You can see these pulses here, and in the 1970s, these little lines are people for scale, so probably about 6 feet tall. And then here again in 2009, and you'll see that from the 40s to the 70s, there was thawing and melting and shrinking of these pulses, and one even disappeared. And then in the next 30 years, you see that all that's left are 2, so 5 are completely gone. So that's the history of the permafrost work, a little history of the Treeline work. I was there for the maiden voyage, if you will, of Earthwatch and the Mackenzies. There's Pete Kershaw and Norm and Barb. If you've met them before, they run the lodge. And there's a marker for Duchenla. And I was doing my PhD research up there on Treeline. So we have these 3 areas where I extracted cross sections from trees, and I was able to count the rings that were put on each year and get sort of an age structure, and also look at the change in growth through time. So this is some of the results of that work. So up here we've got a temperature record going from 1900 up to about 2009, I believe. And you can see this sort of 2-step character to it, where it was cool up until the 30s to the 50s, and there was a bit of a bump rise in temperatures, relative stability, 60s, 70s, and then after the 1980s, we have this warming and a little bit of a plateau at the end of the record. And if we look at so we see increased temperatures in recent years, which also correlates to, these are indices of tree growth. So basically, if the growth is above this horizontal line here, it's enhanced growth, and if it's below, it's suppressed. And the general trends in there really follow temperature, that we see that 2-step nature. And for fir in particular, Abies elasyocarpa, we see this nonlinear change where the growth is unlike anything we've seen over the last 200 years. The trees are doing very well. White spruce is growing faster as well, not to the same extent as fir. But we've seen this warming, and the trees are growing really well. So we look at the demographics. So what this is a histogram of the number of trees that started growing in a given decade at those 3 sites. So it's a frequency on the vertical axis here, and then time on the X. Then we see that there is an increase in the number of trees growing in the area up until maybe the 1930s, 1940s. During that warm period, the first step in that double step in the temperature. But in recent years, we find virtually no new trees. And so we were very curious. Well, the trees are growing really fast. We saw in the past a lot more trees were growing in warmer periods. Why aren't we seeing more trees now? And we think that's because there's something else that's really moved into the area besides trees, and that's shrubs. So I've got some repeat photos here of, this is a gravel pit. You can see some drums that were dumped probably in the 1940s, or maybe during the cleanup in the subsequent years. And if you look at that same picture 30 years later, you can really see the shrubs have come in. And they really like disturbances, so this is expected. You've got a gravel pit. Same with the road. Here's the road in 1944. The Duchenla's just up at the top of this hill. And 60-some years later, you can see a lot more shrubs. You can't even see these barrels anymore because they're just covered by shrubs. And also across the landscape, you've seen some infilling. And this is more of the same. Here's a bridge closer to the Tissue River that is no longer there, as you see in the 2008 photo. And you can really see how it was mostly sedges and grasses, maybe some stunted shrubs, but now a lot of thick shrub growth there. And basically they outcompete the trees. They both need light, but the shrubs are able to get in there faster. They take over the canopy, and they really take all the resources for themselves. So we were interested in quantifying this. So what is really limiting the tree's ability to colonize? And so this is our hypothesis, that it's related to the vegetation cover, but we want to actually test this. So cue the global treeline range expansion experiment, which is a global collaborative effort to look at what are some non-climate related limitations on treeline advance. And we've got a little map here of all these red dots. Those are areas where these sites exist, these G-tree sites. And what the project does is we have several different treatments. We've got areas that we are sort of controls and areas that we seed. So we want to test if there was a good amount of seed available, could trees actually grow? And then within each of those, we've got areas where we've done nothing to the substrate, and other areas where we've simulated a disturbance. So something like, say, a fire that comes through. If a fire came through and wiped out all those shrubs and that vegetation, would that be beneficial for trees to grow? And this is based on some recent work that suggests that we're going to see more fires covering more of the boreal forest, occurring more frequently and potentially higher severity. So we wanted to look at the nature of some of these mechanisms. So we plant seed, we don't plant seed, and we go out and we survey each year. So you can see some of these are baby trees. These are 1, 2 years old, so very small, very hard to find. And so we mark them each year to keep track of how many new ones come each year and how many survive in a given year. So this is some of the preliminary results from that work. We set up 4 sites. We've got 2 in the alpine. So we've got a north-facing alpine, a south-facing alpine. So alpine just means above tree line. And then down at tree line, we've put it in these thick shrubs that occur a little bit lower in elevation. And we've got a site where we manipulated the shrubs. We got rid of them to see if we removed the shrubs, would we see more trees growing? And some of the results of that in the alpine, there's a clear seed limitation that if you were able to get good seed up there, you could grow trees. So this is the same configuration as it was on the last slide, where we've got our unseeded, our seeded, and then our vegetated, and scarified means we've removed the vegetation. And you can just look at these dark lines. These are average values. And the only place where we actually see seedlings germinating or growing is in areas where we've seeded. So there's a clear seed limitation. Whereas further down, where we'd expect, okay, there's actually trees here, we'd expect if we remove shrubs, we remove the competing vegetation, we should see more trees growing. But in all the time up there, we've only counted 1 or 2. We just don't find any seedlings. And we actually don't find any seeds either. When you're surveying in the alpine, we'll see seeds that just didn't grow. But down in near tree line, we don't find any seeds, we don't find any seedlings, we just find nothing. So what we think is going on is that there are other limitations beyond just vegetation, that there's predation of the seeds. And we know that there's a small mammal population up there that lives in these shrubs because they're protected from predators, and there's researchers that go up there and sprinkle seeds to feed them over the summer. So it's a great place to live and thrive. So to test this last summer, the Earthwatchers really helped me out here by building these cages out of this wire. And we put these cages out, we cover half of each plot, and we've got little temperature sensors in there to see how it changes the microclimate. And when we go up in August this year, we're gonna see if our hypothesis was correct. So we'd expect to see much more seed germination in these covered plots as opposed to the uncovered ones, because we're eliminating the predators from here. Okay, the permafrost in the Mackenzie Mountains. We've got 5 sites that some of you may be familiar with. And here's a pulse at what we call Harefoot. Here is another pulse up Peat Plateau at Beaver Pond. We've got two very close together at Dale Creek. And here's Goose Flats, our high elevation site. You can see the weather stations on there. There's a solar panel. And so we're recording microclimate there. And this is what the temperatures look like over the record dating back to 1990. So the elevation is coded by color. So higher elevation sites, Goose Flat is blue. And then as you go further down in elevation, it becomes red. And then we've got two other data sets that we downloaded to present with the data that we've recorded. And some things jump out that when we look at the June through September, so the growing season temperatures, we do see some increase, but it's not statistically significant. So I haven't fit any trend lines to it. And we see that in the summertime, the higher elevation sites are cooler. It's what you'd expect. You go up in elevation, the temperature drops. Whereas in the wintertime, it's actually the reverse. We don't really see trends at all. We see a lot of variability. And we see that the high elevation sites, the red ones, are actually much cooler. They drop several degrees below the high elevation sites. And the reason for this is cold air drainage. So as the air cools, it becomes more dense. It actually pools in these valley bottoms. So our low elevation sites are actually much colder in the winter, which promotes much more cold essentially penetrating the ground, and you get bigger pulses at lower elevations. And even though we didn't see a significant increase in temperatures above ground, when we look at below ground, so we've got the subsurface here at 150 centimeters below the surface, virtually all the sites show significant trends in temperature increases. So an insignificant amount of warming for the air actually may translate into a significant amount of warming in the permafrost. So each year we go up and we measure active layer depth, and I'll show you some of those data in a sec, but I'll show you how we do that. So these are some volunteers from last year that are probing the permafrost. We've got Michelle and Adam using a graded spike essentially, and you shove it into the ground and you pull it out, and you can measure how far it took till you got to the permafrost and it won't budge anymore. And we've got hundreds and hundreds of repeat measurements, so we can get a good idea of how deep the ground thaws each summer. And we've been collecting those data since the early 90s. And so we've got the thaw depth here on the vertical axis and time on the X. And you see as we go forward in time, these are arranged from low to high elevation, that they're all showing significant deepening over time. But it's only the sites that don't have shrubs that are actually showing significant trends. So the vegetation actually plays an interesting role, that it sort of helps preserve the permafrost. And in areas where you don't have shrubs, you're probably going to get quicker, steeper slopes of thawing through time. And so one really conspicuous site is Harefoot. So this is some repeat air photos, where you can see the pulsar outline here, and it goes from the 40s to 2010. And I've only got 4 or 5 images here, so it goes pretty quick, but you can see the dark areas that appear are water. So those show areas of permafrost that have completely thawed and melted away. So you can actually see this feature shrink over the 60 years. And the thaw depth is increasing steadily over time, but there's these abrupt shifts that occur. So we went up in 2013, and at site Harefoot, we saw a big portion of the pulsar collapsed all in 1 year. And so it was probably on the order of 10% of the pulsar just disappeared. So it collapsed, it thawed into this cavern, and then that cavern itself collapsed a year later, and now it's covered up that area. So it's essentially put its insulation back on. When that vegetation was removed, you had heat that could enter the frozen core of the feature, really melted out, and eventually the feature collapsed on itself. So there's not permafrost there anymore, but now there's not going to be this, at least for the foreseeable future, another abrupt shift. But the two main things I want you to take away from this is that there's these gradual changes occurring over time, for example, in thaw depth, but in the actual area of some of these pulses, they're shrinking gradually, but then you get these spurts where they shrink in these really big and noticeable ways. So I'll show one more video showing this. So this is the Harefoot site again. So here's our weather station. That's about 150 centimeters. This is a snow stake that we used to get snow depth. And this is actually about 2.5 meters tall. And you'll see winter come on and a lot of snow accumulates in the area that has actually been melting, which is actually part of the reason why it's melted so quickly, because the snow acts like a blanket and doesn't allow the permafrost to cool as much. So you've got this snow feedback that's causing it to thaw quite a bit in these abrupt events. So the snow almost tops the snow stake. We have a guy line break. But now watch this area over here. So this is an area underlain by permafrost. And you'll actually see this is all happening within one season, that the ice is melting within and that water is flowing away and you're actually having collapse of the material on top. So the pulses are going in ebbs and flows. Okay, so there's a bit more on the Mackenzies relative to Churchill. So this will go a little quicker. So some history about Treeline at Churchill. These are some air photos in the area from 1929 to 1978. And you'll see this arrow highlights the same area in both photos. And you've got all these, it sort of looks like iron filings from here, but these are all trees, these dark areas. And you can see Treeline is roughly coincides with that arrow in the 20s. And then 50 years later, you can see trees have actually moved further to the northwest. So there have been tree line changes in the past, and this coincides with that 1930s to 1950s warm period. And one of the ways that tree line can actually feed back with permafrost is we've got a bit of a chronosequence here. This is the work of Peter Scott, one of our predecessors. And he's got young tree islands grading to very old tree islands. And what can happen over time? So you get these patches of trees that are surrounded by tundra, so we just call them an island. And you get a lot of vegetation that is able to grow within the shelter of those islands, and it accumulates into these thicker organic layers. So these thicker layers of peat, and those act like a blanket that insulate the ground in the summertime so the heat can't penetrate. You can actually get aggradation of the permafrost, so these hatched areas. So one scenario is that you can get more trees out on the tundra and presumably get thinner active layers as the permafrost migrates upwards. So when I came up, I was an undergrad student in 2003, and I was helping a master's student with her work on revegetation of gravel pits. So we spent a lot of time on our knees with our butts in the air, which we affectionately called the cranial rectal inversion. Anybody who's done plant surveys will be unfortunately familiar with this. And I liked it so much that I went up and did my master's and PhD, part of my PhD work up there. And I sampled trees at 3 sites near Churchill. And here's photos of some of the many, many teams that have helped with this work over the years. So the 3 species are larch, white spruce, and black spruce. And larch is a needle leaf tree, but it's deciduous. So that means that it actually loses its leaves in the wintertime relative to the spruce, which are evergreen. And I've got a similar figure to the one you saw earlier where we've got temperature. And you can see that sort of double step again, the warm period in the 30s, 50s, and really warm in recent years. So we see that increase. This is tree growth again, following the same shape with some increase in recent years for white spruce and some for black, but the larch have what have really taken off. So if you were to extend this record actually back to its very end, which is about 400 years ago, the growth we're seeing in the recent years is actually unlike anything we've seen in 4 centuries. So that's tree growth. When we look at the demographics, so this is similar to the histogram you saw, only now it's a line. We see that white spruce in blue again, it peaked in establishment in the 30s to 50s. So warming seemed to be driving the population. And in recent years, we don't see as many, and same for black spruce. But larch in the last 30, 40 years have really taken off. So it seems like larch is really able to take advantage of the warming that's occurred, particularly over the last few years. So it's growing faster, and we're seeing more of them. And one last figure I'll show here is we're comparing the number of seedlings we found in the forest in gray and at tree line in white to the relative abundance of different vegetation types. So how many seedlings were in moss relative to how frequently you see moss across the landscape. And I'll just point out 2 things here. We see that lichen, which actually typically outcompetes tree seedlings, and we see this in the forest, that this habitat index is basically a ratio of the preference. It's an index of the preference of the seedlings for that type of vegetation. And in the forest, we see seedlings avoid it. They can't compete with the lichens. The lichens will actually grow over the seedlings, or they'll uproot them. Whereas when you get past tree line, where conditions are more stressful, because mostly due to winter conditions where you've got wind-blown snow that's like a sandblaster that just kills the foliage on these seedlings, that if they can get some sort of shelter, it's like they're putting aside their differences, saying, okay, we don't get along in the forest, but out at tree line, let's put aside our differences and maybe one of us can get helped out. And it's the same for shrubs that we see. This box is below this threshold, which suggests this is sort of the line of uncertainty, basically. So if it's above or below that line, we know there's a preference above or avoidance below for seedlings. So the type of vegetation on the landscape is actually shaping the recent demographics. So we put out G-tree plots up here as well to quantify some of these vegetation effects. So we've got plots out here at a tundra site, at a tree island, at the tree line, so the edge of the forest, and then within the forest. And we're in the home stretch here. I'll just show you some results of this and some permafrost work. So it's the same treatments, unseeded, seeded, and then vegetated and unvegetated within those. Tundra, just what you expect. It's very harsh conditions. We see little success. In the tree island, we see that there might be evidence for seed limitation, particularly for larch. But in the unseeded plots, we do see some natural establishment. So there is seed out there, but only for white spruce naturally. And there's not much for tamarack or larch. So we have to actually plant that seed. So there is some seed limitation, but it seems species specific. We don't see any black spruce. At tree line, there might be evidence of seed limitation, but white spruce, we do see it growing in unseeded plots. Same with black spruce. And then it seems like the larch is seed limited again, but we have found very few seedlings, which is very strange. And it's the same in the forest, that we see little success in areas where we put out seed, where we'd expect there to be a lot of success. And we feel that there could be this same other overriding factor of small mammals that eat the seeds. And we see some evidence of this. Now, this is from squirrels, that these are 2 spruce seeds from a cone bract. And this is what the seed normally looks like. Here's the wing, and here's the good spot that gets eaten. So these voracious predators presumably eat the seed that we put out. So we've done the same thing as in the Mackenzies. We put out these exclosures, and come next growing season, so 2017, we'll see if this has had an effect. So the last thing I'll talk about before I wrap up is the permafrost. But because this is continuous permafrost, unlike in the Mackenzies, So we've got permafrost underlying more than 90% of the landscape. We'll talk about some of the peak plateaus, polygonal peak plateaus, which are these all these cracks you see here. And how they form is you have permafrost, and then here's the active layer, and as things cool, you'll get a crack that penetrates into the permafrost. And come summer, you thaw this, the active layer thaws, and you get snow melt and water that can percolate down into that crack that just wedges it a little bit. So that's at the end of the first summer. You repeat this 500 times where you get that crack reforming in the winter and then ice forming in the summer. It gradually wedges the landscape apart. And so each one of these dark lines is actually one of those ice wedges that delineates these polygons. So we've got 2 study sites that are underlain by permafrost and form these polygonal peak plateaus. So we've got the polygonal peak plateau aggrading, where we actually see this is the top of the soil surface, that the permafrost is actually moving towards the surface over time, which is interesting considering we've seen warming there. And then just 2 kilometers away, we've got the peak plateau degrading. You can see that these ice wedges have melted out. Now there's a lot of space in between these remnant peak plateaus. And when we look at the climate, or the weather in this case, from 2001 onwards, we see a lot of variability, but some evidence of warming. And then when we look at the thaw depth, oddly enough, in the peak plateau that was aggrading as of 10 years ago is now degrading. So we see thicker active layers through time. And I just did a quick back of the envelope calculation. So this is the average rate of thaw, that it's increasing at about half a centimeter per year, so half a meter per decade. And if you look at how common this type of feature is across the landscape, so it's thawing at half a meter per decade. It covers about 8,000 square kilometers in the region. This will work out to you're thawing 41,000 cubic meters of carbon each year, which suggests a lot of potential for change there. So that's it. Just some of the key points I think to take away from this are that we see changes in treeline and permafrost, particularly in the Mackenzies. We saw that gradual change in thaw depth, but then you get these really rapid episodes of intense melting where a huge portion of a pulsable thaw, and it's gone for essentially the rest of our lifetimes. Treeline, we see some evidence of temperature and climate that's driving some of the population parameters we're seeing, but we also see these widespread other factors that aren't necessarily climate related, like small mammals and other types of vegetation that play a role in the tree distribution across the landscape. So what's next? Well, continued monitoring. If we want to be able to detect change in the landscape, we need a good continuous measurement of the parameters across the landscape in order to see if they're actually changing. So if we want to know if we've changed, we need to know where we've been. So basically we need a baseline from which to compare present and potential future changes. And I'd really like to focus on larch. So I've got some projects going on there looking at the physiology and fine scale growth patterns where we actually measure growth on an hourly basis of some of these trees to see why are they able to take advantage over the normal characters on the landscape, which are white and black spruce. And the monitoring's really been key for some of these changes. If we hadn't had a continuous record, we wouldn't be able to see that they were actually occurring. And they also, because now we've got, in some instances, a multi-decadal record of, say, permafrost thaw and weather, we're able to put some of the current changes that we're seeing on the landscape into a historical context. So is it something we've seen before over the course of this record? And we can reduce the uncertainty in some of these long-term trends. And you guys, as citizen scientists, have been absolutely crucial in keeping this work going, that we're able to collect, because this is a lot of work for, say, just two of us to do if it was just Leanne and I. So having all the hands on deck to collect this data has been very crucial. So there's power in numbers. And then I just really cherish that we can collect the science, but also you get real feedback. You get to see what some of the real-time science is going on, and you don't have to wait for it to get misconstrued in the news. You can actually see for yourself what those changes are. So I think this sort of model is crucial, especially in this day and age, with the type of information. I don't know if you can see my air quotes, the type of information that's out there. I feel like this is a very useful and effective model for science and outreach. So that's it. Sorry, it was a little long, but thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, Steve. That was a lot of information to jam in. It was great to listen to. There's such a long period of time that you all have been up there, and so many scientists, one after another, keeping the research going. It's really amazing to see that history and the results that come from that. So I'm going to try and get in a few of the questions that we got. So the one that we got to start, which was a little while back, asked, how is the amount of organic material inside the permafrost layer measured?
So usually we'll measure this by taking a core. So basically it's a big auger that you drill down through the permafrost, and you drill until you get to the underlying mineral sediments. And you can take a few of these samples and you can basically quantify the amount of organic relative to the total amount of material in there. And you can get an idea of how much biomass or organic carbon is in there.
Thanks, Steve. So another question that we got is from David, and he was asking, sort of comparing the Churchill site to the Mackenzie site, and wondering if the development of shrubs at the forest edge in Churchill is similarly outcompeting the trees there, or if it's just a natural stage in the sequence of colonization of one coming before the other.
Yeah, it's hard to compare the seedling establishment between the two areas because they're so different. We actually don't see a lot of shrubs coming in Churchill relative to the Mackenzie Mountains. And the Mackenzie Mountains, there's a long oral history of hunters going up over the last, really into the 1800s. And that oral history persists, that they talk about how there was no shrubs, or the shrubs that were there were about ankle high. So it's hard to compare, but this G-tree work, we're hoping to actually uncover some of those mechanisms. So it seems like shrubs are limiting in the Mackenzies, and probably not as much in Churchill. But it's true, there is a possibility of some succession, but I suspect it's more a recent phenomenon that there's been a temperature limitation removed from the shrubs.
Got it. Thanks, Steve. I'm going to do one more before we wrap up really quick. This is actually a question that kind of popped in my mind too as you were talking. Do you think the small mammals are going to be able to like burrow under, or like flip up the sensors you have? I know that some of the other sensors you have, like the polar bears, try and get at them. So are the small mammals just as clever?
Yeah, I'm interested to see, because I've read other papers that use the same approach, and there's just some limitations that aren't practical to overcome. So you're right, it's totally possible that the small mammals could burrow underneath these cages, but anybody who's helped me put these out, the bottoms of the cages are very sharp. So if they have to make sure that they dig well under the cage, otherwise they'll probably get stuck in a nasty way. But it's totally possible that they can get underneath there. But we're hoping that it'll be too much effort for them, and they'll say, well, I'll just go over here instead, rather than having to try and dig underneath. But I'll let you know.
Yeah, and I guess if anyone really wants to know, you can sign up and see for yourself.
Woohoo!
Perfect transition there. Thanks so much, Steve, for presenting today. We really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone who's been on the line for joining. Like I just mentioned, you can come and join Steve and Leanne out in the field. We've got teams up for 2017, and we should have them soon for 2018. There's a bunch of teams in Churchill, and there's one team in the Mackenzie that's in August. We've had some changes in funding, and there is a bit of a chance this might be the last year. So if you've been thinking about it, just do it. Sign up. We'd love to have you out there. If you had a friend or you want to share this webinar with someone, we are going to post this on YouTube as well, and everyone who's participated today will get an email with a link to it. Feel free to share it far and wide with anyone that you would like. We love to spread the word about all of the great research projects that Earthwatch works with. And if you're interested in learning more, we'll have another webinar later on in the spring. Mystery topic, you'll find out soon enough. And that's it for today. So I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Bye.